Welcome, one and all. This is the Ancient Journey. On today's journey, the secret snakes of Lake Seminole. But before we get started, I have some terrifying news. Some of my viewers aren't subscribed. So please, if you enjoy this video, hit that like button, share the video, and subscribe. Now let's get started. This is Lake Seminole, near Tallahassee, in the state of Florida. It's maintained by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and if you're an outdoorsman, Lake Seminole seems like heaven. It's got all the wildlife you could handle. With nearly 40,000 acres of water, Lake Seminole is full of fish, waterfowl, and reptiles. And while alligators might be a concern to some people, for Mike Williams, it's the snakes he should have been looking out for. It's just a few days before Christmas, and Mike Williams has outfitted his duck boat for a pre-dawn hunting trip on the lake. It's a busy time for Mike as he's trying to get ready for an anniversary weekend with his wife Denise, but damn, if that lake didn't just keep calling his name. He's up at 3 a.m. and leaves his house for the lake so he can get on the water before sunup and start hunting at first light. Mike found the lake so beautiful that he once confessed to his mother that there were times he would just sit in his boat and just watch, without even having his gun with him to hunt. But this trip would be Mike's last. He never returns home, and by late afternoon, his wife Denise is calling around to friends and family to ask if they had seen or heard from Mike. No one had. Florida Fish and Wildlife and some of Mike's family begin to search for him. Helicopters and airboats are brought in to assist. And later that night, Mike's boat is found. Not by the authorities, but by a man named Brian Winchester. Brian finds the boat empty, with a full gas tank, and Mike's duck decoys still laying in the bottom of the boat, unused. So Mike's boat has been found, but who is Brian? Brian Winchester is Mike's best friend. The two have known each other since high school. As the hours go by, though, that's all anyone finds, just the boat. And then, some 10 days later, one searcher locates what appears to be a hat floating on the water. The hat is identified by Brian as belonging to Mike. And the search continued for almost 2 months, but Mike is never found. By this time, authorities have settled on the grim truth that Mike is likely dead. They assume that while Mike was getting himself set up for a morning of duck hunting, he likely ended up overboard, perhaps from hitting a tree stump, perhaps from a medical event, and then, well, it's too difficult to talk about, really. But the theory has to be put out there by someone. Someone needs to tell his wife, someone needs to tell his mother, don't they? There's a theory that's being speculated that Mike, after falling in the water, may have been eaten by alligators. Alligators will eat just about anything from bullfrogs to crabs to, well, even people if the situation is right. But on the day that Mike went missing, a cold front had pushed into Florida, and it dropped the temperatures well below freezing. And when it gets cold, alligators get cold too, and they also get quite lazy. Being cold-blooded reptiles, alligators' metabolism slows as the temperature drops, meaning not only do they move slowly, but they also just aren't that hungry. And then some 6 months after Mike went missing, the lake rejects some items from its bottom, almost as if it was spitting them out. One day, out of the blue, a pair of chest-high waders and a hunting jacket bobbed to the surface of the lake. They both belonged to Mike. And while neither one bear any sort of tears or teeth marks from an alligator, you'll soon see how they both have the tracks of those snakes that Mike should have been paying more attention to on them. Denise Williams, Mike's wife, was home with their 18-month-old daughter, Ainsley. The loss of a spouse was devastating, but the loss was made a bit less devastating because of Mike's life insurance policy that was worth almost $2 million. Mike was a successful real estate appraiser, but that's not the entire reason he had such a large life insurance policy. He took some of it out after it was recommended to him by his best friend, Brian Winchester. Yes, Brian Winchester, the one who found Mike's boat, who was old buddies and best friends with Mike, that Brian. Brian happened to be an insurance broker and sold Mike some of those policies. And Brian's help didn't end there. Mike, you see, is missing, but can't be assumed to be dead, and insurance companies don't pay out for folks who are just missing. So Brian helps Denise find an attorney to obtain a presumptive death certificate for Mike Williams. Denise is able to obtain paperwork that officially makes Mike deceased only 7 months after his disappearance. It's a process that normally takes 5 years, and Brian gets it done in less than 1. During this time, Mike's mother, Cheryl, still held on to hope that Mike was still alive. She refuses to give up, spending some of her retirement money going on television, taking out advertisements to try to find what happened to Mike. Cheryl even stands at intersections, holding up handmade signs day after day, hoping for information about Mike. And it's not just a mother's intuition that leads her to keep pushing. It's common sense. Cheryl wanted a real police investigation into Mike's disappearance, not just a fish and wildlife case that ended with some alligator theories that never panned out. But Cheryl is warned by Denise to drop it and to have the investigation stopped. And she's threatened that she will never see her granddaughter again if she doesn't. But Cheryl will not and cannot be swayed. She and the police push ahead, and eventually Cheryl gets her way. Law enforcement in Florida abides by her requests and decide to begin investigating the case. It's been 5 years since Mike vanished, and finally, police will begin a real investigation into the matter. But then, in the strangest of coincidences, but again, maybe not, Denise Williams gets married to, of all people, Mike's best friend, Brian Winchester. The marriage doesn't last very long, and in 2012, Denise and Brian are separated and living apart from each other. 4 years go by, which is a long time to think about things for Brian, and Brian cracks. Denise enters her car to drive to work, and while talking on the phone to her sister, looks in the rearview mirror to see someone climbing over the back seat of the car. It's Brian Winchester, yelling directions to her, showing her a gun. Denise isn't having any of it. She pulls the car into a drugstore parking lot and pulls up as close as she can to the front door, hoping that someone inside will see what's happening. And Brian continues breaking down, telling her he's going to kill himself, telling her he has nothing left to live for, and that he never ever wanted to divorce her. But Denise is able to calm Brian down. Eventually, she drives him back to where he had parked his truck. He begs her not to tell police what he's done, and she agrees. But after driving away from him, Denise's foot pushes the accelerator down to the floor, and she heads straight to the police to tell them that Brian had attempted kidnapping her. Brian is arrested and charged with kidnapping, domestic assault, and armed burglary. Denise requests protection from Brian, so he's held without bond while he waits for trial. Brian ends up sentenced to 20 years in prison for the kidnapping, followed by 15 years of probation. And that's it. And to some, this seems like a light sentence, as though some things are missing. In fact, there's a bit of confusion in the public as to why Brian is being treated with such kid gloves. But the next day, that picture suddenly clears up. Florida authorities announce that Mike's body has been found and that he is a victim of homicide. See, when snakes fight or encounter each other, they rarely bite each other. But in this case, Brian Winchester had sunk his fangs directly into Denise Williams. In return for his cooperation, Brian is promised that prosecutors won't seek a life sentence for kidnapping. Brian takes the deal and snaps his jaws shut on Denise. Mike Williams' remains are found at the end of a dead-end road, just 5 miles from where he and his pal, Brian Winchester, grew up. Excavators and search teams spend 5 days digging and recover 98% of Mike's remains. On May 8, 2018, Denise Williams is arrested while leaving work, just minutes before a grand jury had indicted her on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and accessory after the fact. Prosecutors did a masterful job of not showing their hand and held back all their cards for a special release of an indictment. 2 days later, a 3-page indictment is released, and in it, prosecutors reveal that Denise and Brian began planning to get rid of Mike some 9 months before his disappearance. They state that Brian had killed Mike with his own shotgun. Brian took the stand as the star witness. He and Denise had never ended their relationship that the two had started in high school. Their affair began in 1997 and grew into something much larger and much more dangerous. And soon the two decided they needed to get Mike out of the way. Denise and Brian kick around ideas of a boating accident or a robbery attempt, and soon the two settle on the idea of a hunting accident. Brian the snake had enticed Mike to the lake that morning. He stated he had pushed Mike off the boat and then shot him. You can only imagine the moment when Mike must have realized that in the middle of a lake filled with alligators, it was the snake in his boat that was about to do him in. Brian buried Mike and went off to a family Christmas party, only to join the search for him at a later date. He and Snake Denise took their relationship slowly, as not to arouse suspicion and to allow the insurance money to gain some interest. The investigation into Mike's death had begun by this point, and after Brian and Denise were headed for divorce, Brian realized that perhaps Denise wasn't exactly the trustworthy sort, and began to worry that she might sink her fangs into him. Brian, an opportunist as only a snake can be, decided to strike first and turned into a witness against Denise, saving his own snake skin in the process. Denise is sentenced to life in prison after the jury deliberates for just 8 hours. Mike's daughter Ainsley, in her early 20s by this point, is awarded her father's assets and what's left of the insurance money. In 2020, part of Denise's conviction is overturned, but the conspiracy to commit murder sentence is upheld, and she will still serve 30 years in prison. Mike's mother, Cheryl, never gave up, and the investigation into Mike's death may have never begun without her. And while justice caught up with Denise and Brian, it's certainly no replacement for her lost son. Thanks for watching, and thanks for sharing the journey.